All right, we're going to talk about completing the square today and what that represents in it. Completing the square leads to the quadratic formula. Okay, so completing the square is something that we're going to kind of look at to get towards the quadratic formula, but it's also a way that we can solve these. All right, so the first thing is understanding that a lot of times I can just take the square roots of items, and that's going to be my solution. So here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to subtract off 10. I'm going to isolate my x squared. So I end up with 4x squared equals 36. Divide by 4, x squared equals 9. Now, to get rid of a square root, to get rid of a square, I'm going to square root it. So the square root of x squared is x equals. Well, the square root of 9 is two answers. A lot of you are thinking right away, oh, it's 3. That is true, but it's also a negative 3. So this becomes plus or minus 3. So anytime I'm going to take a square root, remember we want to incorporate both sides of it, the positive and the negative. So the next one, I'm going to go ahead and solve it the same way. I'm going to add 5, 3x squared equals 30, divide by 3, x squared equals 10. I'm going to square root both sides. Now, x equals, when I take the square root, I want to make this into plus or minus. Do you know the square root of 10? Okay, I don't want you to put it into your calculator and give me some decimal approximation of the square root of 10. I want you to just leave it as the square root of 10. If you don't know it off the top of your head, I don't want you to plug it in a calculator. Leave it as a square root, okay? Here's our next one. So here I have a quantity squared. So this could have started out as a trinomial of x squared plus 4x plus 4, and I was able to factor that into something squared. So I can still do the square root method here. So I'm going to square root both sides. So that gives me x plus 2 equals, well, the square root of 25 is plus and minus 5. So make sure you kind of do both sides. So this is really what this is saying is this is x plus 2 equals 5 and x plus 2 equals negative 5. And now I have to solve those. So I'm going to subtract off 2, x equals 3. I'm going to subtract off 2, and x equals negative 7. So there's my two answers, 3 and negative 7. Remember that when you take the square root, you have to put it into plus or minus right then. You can't subtract off 2 and say, oh, it's plus or minus 3. That's not how it's done. The square root has to have that plus or minus to it. Okay? So the idea of completing the square is that we want this to get into a perfect trinomial, so to speak. Okay, so when we were looking at factoring, this is that special factor rule. So if I had x squared, I want it to get to be x squared plus bx plus b over 2 quantity squared, okay, equals, and then this allows me to factor it to this. The reason for that is then I can have something like this and I can square root it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take half of my b. So notice here one thing that all completing the squares has in common is we want our a to be 1. We have to get this to just be x squared. We can't have it to be 5x squared. It has to be a coefficient of 1. If it's not, we have to multiply through to get it to be a 1. So to get this number here, what we're going to do is we're going to divide the b in half and then square it. So what this goes is this is going to be negative 10 over 2 quantity squared. So now when I look at this, I get, well, negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. Negative 5 squared is 25. This piece right here is always going to be positive when we're talking about completing the square. So make sure that you divide this. It really doesn't matter if this is negative or positive. You can just ignore the negative sign when you're talking about completing the square, okay? So we're going to kind of go over some steps on completing the square, and then I'm going to give you an example of completing the square. So the first thing is rewrite your quadratic in the form x squared plus bx equals c. So you might have to do a couple steps there. You might have to divide everything by a. So if a is not 1, so if it was 5, I would have to divide everything by 5. Take your constant term, move it to the other side, okay? Then you're going to complete the square by adding b over 2 quantity squared to both sides. So I'm going to take this b, divide it by 2, square it, add it to both sides, okay? Now you're going to factor the trinomial. So you're going to factor this side here into the form quantity x plus b over 2 quantity squared. Okay, so we want it to look like this. On the other side, you're just going to have some constant value. Okay, you're going to then find the square roots and then solve for x. Okay, sounds simple enough. Sometimes this gets a little difficult, so we're going to walk through a process here. So the first thing here is I don't have an a that's 1. So I started off with 3x squared minus 12x plus 6. So the first thing I need to do is get it to be where a is 1. So I'm going to divide every single term by 3. And now I get x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. Well, it also says I need to move my 2 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 2 to both sides. X squared minus 4x equals negative 2. Okay? The next step says, hey, complete the square by adding b over 2 quantity squared to both sides. Okay? So I'm going to take my b and I'm going to divide that by 2. So negative 4 divided by 2. So I end up with this, right? Plus negative 4 over 2 quantity squared equals negative 2 plus negative 4 over 2 quantity squared. I don't really have to worry about that negative in there because anytime I square a negative, then it goes away, okay? So I don't really have to worry about that. Okay? So now this becomes x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 2 plus 4, okay? Let me rewrite this one over here so we have a little bit more room. All right. So now I can factor this left side and simplify the other. So this factors into x minus 2 quantity squared equals 2. Okay. Now this is a good thing because now I have a perfect square on my left side and a number on my right. So now I can take the square root of both sides. I get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. Now to solve this, all I have to do is isolate x. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. This implies 2 different answers. So it implies 2 plus the square root of 2 and 2 minus the square root of 2. We can leave it in this form. That's very common there. It's okay to leave it there. Now the other thing is that completing the square can lead us to the vertex form. Okay? So if I wanted to get this, if you remember, the vertex form is y equals a times the quantity x minus h, quantity squared, plus k. Okay, so that's vertex form. So if we kind of went over here, right here, here I have x minus 2 quantity squared equals 2. If I would just bring this 2 to the other side, I'm in vertex form. So what we're going to do is, here's my problem. What I'm going to do is if I add something to one side, if I'm on the same side, I'm going to subtract it. So y equals x squared plus 4x plus 4 over 2 quantity squared minus 6 minus 4 over 2 quantity squared. And the reason I'm minusing it here is because it's on the same side. So here I have a plus 4 over 2 quantity squared and a minus 4 over 2 quantity squared. So these actually equate out to 0. 0, it does not change our function when we add it. So now I'm looking at x squared plus 4x plus 4, looking at that, minus 10, right? Because this is going to be 4, 6 minus 4. So now I can factor this and do x plus 2 quantity squared minus 10. There's my vertex form, okay? So completing the square is really useful in solving these quadratics. It's something that you could do on any of them. Sometimes it does take a little bit more time because like over here you saw, the first thing we had to do is get a to be 1. We had to move our constant term to the other side, and then we have to understand kind of what that, how to factor that and get those pieces. So remember to follow those steps, those 5 steps, and you should be able to complete the square.